What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so with Star Wars The Last Jedi coming out, which I'm really excited about, I'm really hyped about that movie because it'll be like the first time that Disney creates a movie that's not kind of like a remake of another one. I mean, that's one of the things that's really up for debate. You know, with Star Wars The Force Awakens, basically just like a reskinned Episode 4. I'm not going to get into that huge debate because fans argue about that right now. It's pretty intense. If you go into Star Wars forums or the Star Wars subreddit or something like that, you'll see a lot of people who are arguing over whether or not The Force Awakens was a reskin of Episode 4. But regardless of the scenario, what I want to do here is I want to run over the origin of the Jedi, and I think it's kind of cool. Now, one thing I want you guys to keep in mind is that when it comes to Star Wars lore, there is a frame of reference, and the frame of reference is basically the final battle of Star Wars Episode 4 when they blew up the Death Star for the very first time. Usually in Star Wars lore, that's referred to as the Battle of Yavin. And so what you'll have is somebody will say 36,000 years BBY. That means 30,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, before that actual battle in Star Wars Episode 4. Now, the reason why people say before the Battle of Yavin instead of 30,000 years before Episode 4 is because in the Star Wars mythos, there were a lot of things that were going on outside of the movies. I mean, there were a lot of comics that were being written, a lot of books that were being written that were really expanding on a lot of the Star Wars mythos. And so if we said a year before Episode 4, in reality, it's a year before the Battle of Yavin, because Luke Skywalker, it took a little bit of time for him to like find the rebellion and then join the rebellion and then go off and face off against the Death Star, things like that. So it would create a little bit of confusion and it would create some continuity issues. And so for the most part, whenever you see BBY, just think of it as, 30 or however many years, before that particular battle, the fight against the Death Star at the climax of Episode 4. And so the reason why I give you that frame of reference is because this story picks up around 36,000 years before that battle in Star Wars Episode 4. It's a massive amount of time, way back in the past. And what we end up doing here is we actually end up picking up with a race called the Dai Bendu. And what they're basically doing is they are worshiping something called the Thoyor. Not only that, they've arrived on other planets, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But what this seems to indicate is that while this Thoyor has been here for quite some time, that this race, as it's been progressing, has basically been worshiping the Thoyor. Now again, because we're not given any definitive details, it's kind of up to us to sort of put our finger on it and sort of say, okay, how do we interpret this? So what we could probably get away with here is basically saying this Thoyor probably appeared in the very early days of the Dai Bendu society when they were still relatively primitive. And so like any race that comes across something they don't understand, they will either destroy it or they'll worship it as a god. And that's essentially kind of what happened here. Now, as time progressed, it really stopped being this Thoyor is a god so much as this Thoyor houses secrets that are waiting to be discovered. But the funny thing about this is something that I hope you notice is there's reference to the idea that philosophers and mystics sense a kind of energy being emitted from this Thoyor. And so what this does is it lays the seeds for basically saying that people began to emerge, various alien races began to emerge with some of their members being sensitive to the Force. And so what ends up happening is that somewhere along the line, the Thoyor activates. And when it does, it basically begins grabbing members who are sensitive to its tune, essentially meaning they're sensitive to the Force. They board the Thoyor and they basically take off for parts unknown. And the same thing happens on other planets across the entire galaxy. The Wookiees on Kashyyyk, for example, all these different people, all these different races that basically have philosophers, mystics who are able to feel the Force more or less are brought aboard the Thoyor and they're essentially taken off to the center of the galaxy. Now, what ends up happening here is they're brought to this sort of Force-sensitive planet called Tython. And the whole idea behind this is that Tython is in a state of flux. It's really one of these things where it's kind of a testing ground in the sense that when these Force sensitives are brought to Tython, what they begin to realize is that the song they're hearing, so to speak, or the energy they're picking up is the Force itself. And so over the course of, several years, they began tapping into the Force itself and using the Force for a variety of different purposes. Some of it was used to tame wild beasts. Others were used to basically sort of meditate and learn what it is that they could do with the Force, moving objects around, different things like that. But as time began to progress, what they began to notice is that the planet Tython, because it was very much a Force-sensitive planet and it was in a state of flux, the only way to keep the planet calm, which is to say to stop these massive earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, different things like that, was to basically be in tune with the Force. And so that's the difference here. This is the difference between the original Jedi and the Jedi as we know them now. Luke Skywalker and like Rey, they basically follow the light side of the Force, whereas you have Darth Vader and like Emperor Palpatine, you know, and like Kylo Ren, who follow the dark side of the Force. Initially, it wasn't like that. A perfect balance is what had to exist. And that's why there's all these allusions in the Star Wars mythos bringing balance to the Force, because it all hails back to the original role of the Jedi. Now, of course, even then, the way they were pronounced, or the way the name was spelled back then, was actually a lot different than it is now. Now it's just J-E-D-I. But back then, it was J-E'-D-A-I-I. So, I mean, how you pronounce it, I think is kind of up to interpretation. I mean, I would just call it like Jedi, but it is cool because as these various Force sensitives began to learn that the peaceful nature of the planet was contingent on how in tune they were with the balance in the Force, they began to realize they had to maintain balance almost 100% of the time. Following this, they began doing things like erecting civilizations, more or less building a society for themselves. And so again, it's very much the origin of it all, how it all starts. Now, following this, the most logical scenario begins to unfold in the sense that these various beings start to procreate. And again, another difference between the modern day Jedi. Modern day Jedi in Star Wars are not allowed to maintain relationships. The idea is that if they start to engage in love, different things like that, then it can lead them down the path to the dark side by allowing emotion to invoke feelings that they would otherwise have to shy away from. And so because of this, some of these children who were born to these Force sensitive people were themselves not Force sensitive. And so as a result, what they ended up finding is the planet itself became very, very harsh and dangerous to those who were not in balance with the Force. And so, of course, just for the sake of making sure that these individuals stayed safe as well as keep the planet in harmony, they began sort of casting off their children. Now, it wasn't something done out of malice. It was one of those things where a lot of people began to feel emotions. They were basically cutting off a piece of themselves. They didn't want to, but it's what was required of them. But notice this, they begin to sort of transition to this idea that the Force is a way of life. It's not a concept that you think about. It's not a belief system. It's a way in which you live your life. And in order for them to live their lives in this fashion, they basically have to move those who are not Force sensitive away from the planet. And so what we end up finding out is that Tython itself was orbited by two suns. One of these was a sun called Ashla, and the other one was Bogan. Now, initially, these beings began to take up residence. Those who were more or less pushed out took up residence on the moons, and then, of course, from there, began expanding out into the rest of the galaxy as it existed. But this is interesting because a kind of creed is formed. As is given here, the concept of the Jedi and even the Sith in terms of a mystic order of monks and philosophers who form an organized society who are more like the Shaolin than anything else is really one of these things where they sort of form like a creed for themselves. For those of you guys who are familiar with regards to modern day Jedi, this original oath is actually pretty different. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no fear, there is power. I am the heart of the Force. I am the revealing fire of light. I am the mystery of the darkness in balance with chaos and harmony. This is the whole idea of the original Jedi. They were in balance with the Force. How these things began to unfold is still relatively primitive at this point in time. The great thing about a lot of these stories is they'll go on to do things like, you know, like this is really part of a story called Force Storm, but there's things like the Force War. There's the first Jedi who fell to the dark side. They became Dark Jedi, eventually discovered the race called the Sith, more or less, you know, gave themselves the same name, returned, waged war against the Jedi. You have things like the Great Hyperspace War. You have all these scenarios that began to unfold that sort of brought in this whole early day and the early formations and then the eventual rise of the Sith Empire that existed in direct opposition to the Jedi themselves. But again, all these people are basically finding balance. They recognize there's a dark side of the Force. They recognize there's a light side of the Force. They recognize both sides have their use, and they strike a balance in between the two of them. It's not by choice, it's by necessity because of what the planet dictates in terms of how individuals function. Now, one of the first major tests of the Jedi basically began to come awry when we ended up having a particular woman who rose to prominence on one of the settled worlds. The other half of this is that because the children of these Jedi were basically pushed out and sent to other worlds, raised by other individuals or what have you, these kids basically became estranged to their parents. And so when a woman named Hadia basically began the process of going through and conquering all these worlds and then pressing them all under her service, meaning she was a queen of, you know, entire systems, when she began to look at the Jedi and refuse to accept their teachings and essentially spark a war called the Despo War between her own empire and the Jedi themselves, this basically led to Jedi Jedi who ended up having to fight their own kids. But what this began to do was sow the seeds of the idea of the formation of dark Jedi, that some Jedi began to come to this belief that with them losing the kind of things that they did, that maybe balance in the Force isn't necessarily the way to go, that peace in the galaxy has to exist, but sometimes the only way to ensure that peace is to force people into it. Now, in truth, we're kind of reading between the lines here. We're really just sort of inferring this based on the information that we have. In truth, I would argue the Despo War was probably more in tune with forming the modern day Jedi as we know them, in the sense that with this war being so colossal, spanning so many systems and so many planets and involving so many people, that I would imagine a lot of the Jedi as we know them now, these members that existed back then, basically began to sort of cut themselves off from emotion, different things like that, and simply saying that there were people who weren't able to, quote unquote, pull the trigger on various enemies or various forces or so on and so forth. And as a result, their weakness comes in the fact that they are too emotional. We're kind of inferring these things. This origin story is pretty quick. I mean, it kind of expands a lot more during the actual Force Storm story, the events following this Despo War, how this Jedi society began to sort of cope with these different things, what eventually led into the formation of the Dark Jedi. A lot of that's covered in like Force Storm and Force Wars and things like that. But in terms of how the Jedi came to be, how people were able to tap into the Force for the very first time, this is it. Remember, this is very ambiguous. There's a lot of cloak and dagger stuff here. For the most part, all we know is that these, Thoyor were just on planets one day. The Force has existed for quite some time. People began to rise that were able to tap into the Force. The Thoyor grabbed them, took them to the center of the galaxy, threw them on a Force-sensitive planet. They had to find balance in order to keep the planet in check. They cast off those who weren't Force-sensitive, and that was really about it. From there, they began to evolve and progress and grow according to their own creeds and philosophies and different things like that. But again, it's pretty interesting, pretty quick, but I think it's pretty fun. It's definitely one of the more interesting origin stories that's out there in terms of the various heroes and characters that exist in fiction. I think it's pretty cool. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.